Good morning or good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm moderating the 10th panel session in our Fathers for Pixels Livestream series. Now, through the Fathers for Pixels panel sessions, the Pixel Project is providing a platform and learning resource for fathers across the world to step up to speak out about the importance of combating sexism, misogyny, and violence against women in their families and communities. Now, each live stream YouTube session features 2 to 3 panelists discussing a topic on fatherhood and how dads can help stop violence against women in their families, communities, and cultures. Each session will also include a live moderated Q&A session for dads and communities to ask questions. Now, our topic today is between God and man, the impact of religion on fatherhood and male role modeling. And here to take part in today's discussion panel are 3 faith leaders who are dads themselves. And I'm going to put everyone on screen so we can introduce everyone. Good evening, everyone. So here we go. So Imam Dr. Abdul Patel, who is right below me on screen, is the founder and past coordinator of the Canadian Council of Imams and has been serving as an Imam and community leader for 53 years. He's a founder and member of several interfaith groups and has served on boards of hospitals, social services, community legal clinics, international development, and relief organizations. He is the recipient of the Governor General and Ontario Government's awards for community service and Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, and holds a doctorate degree from the Canadian Institute of Islamic Studies. Rabbi Cory Weiss, who is next to me, is the Rabbi of Temple Har Zion in Thornhill, Ontario. Did I pronounce that correctly, Zion?
Zion or Zion, it's fine, either one.
Okay. He is a member of the Toronto Board of Rabbis, the Reformed Rabbis of Greater Toronto, and the Greater Toronto Interfaith Clergy Curling Club. Rabbi Weiss also serves as a York Regional Police Chaplain, and he has received his rabbinical ordination at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 1993. He is a composer who has written compositions for synagogues throughout North America. And last but not least, Pastor Schori, who is right below Rabbi Weiss on this screen, lives in Chicagoland with his wife Brandy and 3 daughters, Hannah, Mia, and Ava. And Neil has served as a pastor in several churches and is known for his love of advocacy for victims of domestic violence, which stemmed from his involvement in a high-profile murder and missing persons case with people in his church. Now, you, the audience, will also be able to ask them questions live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Anusha, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to our panel to answer. And please note that we do not tolerate any of the isms. No racism, no sexism, no misogyny, no anything. If you put anything of that on about that, you write anything about that in our comment section, we will delete it and you will be booted. We do not tolerate abuse. Now for introduction to what we are going to be talking about today. Critics of organized religion, as well as many people fighting for women's human rights and gender equality, have observed that sexism and misogyny are explicitly embedded within the dogma and traditions of all mainstream religions. Many religions disallow the full ordination of women into religious leadership. Some religions forbid women from sitting in front of their places of worship, and some places of worship even ban women from entry. Many religious texts promote the belief that women are mentally, morally, and spiritually inferior to men, and religion is routinely used to justify both extreme and pedestrian forms of gender inequality across the world. Prominent examples of extreme forms range from Catholic priests and evangelical pastors who advise women that it is their duty to stay with abusive husbands, to ultra-Orthodox Jewish men who insist on sex-segregated seating even in public spaces like airplanes, to the ruling powers of Islamic nations such as Afghanistan and Iran, who use religion to justify systematically taking away the rights of women in their countries. Now, when he broke away from the Southern Baptist Church that he had been a member of for most of his life, US President Jimmy Carter pointed out, and I quote, "The truth is that male religious leaders have had and still have an option to interpret holy teachings either to exalt or subjugate women. They have, for their own selfish ends, overwhelmingly chosen the latter. Their continuing choice provides the foundation of justification for much of the pervasive persecution and abuse of women throughout the world. Today, in acknowledgement of the power of religion and male religious leaders to influence the attitudes of individuals, communities, and countries towards women and girls, as well as societal ideas of masculinity and the role of fathers, this panel will be talking about the impact of religion on fatherhood and how male religious leaders can take the lead in teaching fathers in their faith communities to be non-violent, non-misogynistic, and non-sexist parents and role models. So with all this in mind, let's get the discussion rolling. Welcome, Imam, Patel, Rabbi Weiss, and Pastor Schori. Thank you for joining us this evening. And to start things off, what is the best thing about being a dad? And I think we'll go clockwise. Let's start with Rabbi Weiss.
Okay, I have two sons and a goddaughter who I helped to raise. So I'm very proud of my children. The best things about being a dad to me are watching my children grow up and become adults, teaching my sons and sharing my idea of life's wisdom with them, learning and sharing what they love to do, sharing my passions with them. I'm blessed to have one in each of my professions. I was a musician first, and my younger son's a musician, and my older son is a rabbi. Watching them and knowing that our Jewish future will continue through them, and having a lot of fun together, but also being able to talk to them about the most important things in life.
Okay.
My favorite.
Pastor Schori?
Yeah, so I've got three daughters. One just finished her freshman year of college, and I have two that just finished their freshman year of high school. And one of the things that I often say about being a dad of three daughters is that nothing made me lean towards becoming a feminist more than having daughters. I love them. I just so much enjoy being a girl dad. I knew I was kind of made to be a girl dad. I had people tell me that when I was growing up, and I didn't always know how to take that, but now there's just nothing about it other than just pure joy for me. Plenty of challenges, but I love watching them grow and just being with them and entering into the things that they enjoy doing. I just enjoy every bit of it.
Okay, Imam Patel?
Yes, thank you, and good evening, everyone. Hello, Rabbi Weiss. Good to see you on the Zoom.
Good to see you, Imam.
And Reverend Schori, good to meet you with you.
You too.
Yeah. I have three children, my two eldest daughters, and a son. And I have also grown up in my brother's house where I watched three children from birth and his other daughter. So I was also acting kind of as a co-father because in helping him out, taking them to schools and other places as well. So, but my three children born here in Canada, my eldest daughter, she is a teacher, as well as my second one is also a teacher, and my wife also works in the school as well as a student teacher. So, but my son, who has studied political science and made his way from constituency office to the prime minister's office, I would say. So, last year he quit that job. He has enough, and he is now working privately. So I have raised these three children, I would say, and today I can say I have 8 grandchildren. Yeah, The oldest is 17 and the youngest is a year old. So I have also, I love the grandchildren. In India, there is a saying that, because I'm Indian by birth, I would say, that interest is more valuable than principle. So the children are the interest. And my daughters, when I have two daughters, I reflect on my Islamic teaching. The Prophet Muhammad said in one of his sayings, peace be upon him, that whoever raised three daughters with good conduct, good morals, and so on, they have a really guaranteed entry into paradise. So someone asked, how about two daughters? He says, well, two also and one as well. So such an importance placed on the daughters, really, by the Prophet for raising them. So that's about my family introduction. We can continue the dialogue on the questions you have. These are powerful questions, no doubt.
Yeah. So let's talk about the role of fathers. The role of fathers in fatherhood has undergone significant changes over the past 50 years or so, thanks in part to feminism's championing of gender equality in all spheres of life, including pushing for fathers who are more proactive and involved parents who treat their children of all genders with equal love and regard. Do you think that ideas of fatherhood and masculinity in religious communities and families have progressed apace or struggled with these social changes? Let's start with Rabbi Weiss.
Okay. I'm going to first say that if you want to see good models of fatherhood, you probably should not look to a lot of the Hebrew Bible. There are absent fathers there. There are fathers who favored one child over another and caused a lot of problems. Our founder, Abraham, was asked by God to sacrifice his son and almost did it. So it's not the place. Moses was an absent father. It's not really the best place to look, but I will say that Judaism is a religion that evolves. In some of the movements of Judaism, the more traditional movements, it evolves a little slower than in our Reform movement, which is the most liberal kind of Judaism, but we all have evolved. And so over time, our rabbis, who were our teachers for the last 2,000 years, understood the responsibilities of fatherhood differently than their biblical forebears, teaching the responsibilities of fathers toward children. And over time, our movement, which is over 200 years old now, has been working toward full egalitarianism, full gender equality, almost since its start. And so I believe that egalitarianism in our religious life has helped lead to more egalitarianism in all of society. We were the first Jewish movement to ordain women in 1972, and women taking on new roles in our movement have really changed the way we are Jewish, aesthetically, theologically, liturgically. Women taking a bigger role in synagogue life means doing things differently. And men who ran our institutions for so long had to start listening more carefully to women's viewpoints and life experiences. And so they have changed the way that we practice and the way that we see ourselves as fathers in a more egalitarian world, sharing roles and trying to be models for our sons and daughters.
How about you, Pastor Schori?
I would say that in Christendom, there's been a little bit of a struggle to be reactive rather than proactive. And I would say one of the things I've said often is that the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement, you might have seen these on social media. I think they've actually been a wonderful, wonderful reckoning for the church, because there's so much abuse that's been covered up in religious communities, and women who are coming forward and some men who are coming forward to share their stories forces us to look at things that are being done systemically that are unhealthy and that actually go against the faith that we claim. So it's not been as proactive as what I think it needs to be, but sometimes a reaction is the very first step to becoming proactive. And I do see more and more things happening, even in the the Southern Baptist Convention recently. Pastor Rick Warren, he was the pastor at Saddleback Church, the founder of Saddleback Church, came forward and shared that he changed his view on women in ministry, women being ordained after 40 plus years of being the pastor at Saddleback. So I do think that there are things that are changing, but we're a little behind the curve.
Okay. Imam Patel?
Yes, I like to pick up on Rabbi Cory Weiss's example because we share a common heritage, Abrahamic faith. And next week, on June 28th, we will be celebrating our Eid, commemorating the sacrifice of Abraham, of his son. Now, from the Islamic perspective, and I've been giving sermons for the last 2 Fridays on this subject as well, that especially emphasizing the father, because the Quranic verse states about the vision that Prophet Abraham saw about sacrificing his son. And he asks his son, he consults his son, who was in his teen years, according to our historical record. And it said, and I say, how many fathers consult their own children? No matter what age they are. Because this is something, a prophetic example that you can see that Abraham got something so drastic that he is consulting his son that God is asking me to slaughter you. If any father says that today, say, hey, let's visit the nearest psychiatric clinic. So this is something that we have to learn, but somehow people have misinterpreted religion of Abrahamic faith in general, I would say, that gives somehow superiority to men over women. And this is where they have to come to understand, because even in the Quranic verse, one says that men have a degree above the woman, means that the man has the degree to support the woman, to earn. And certain our bodies are different, so what men can do is that how they are equal in the eyes of God. Their worship is no less than each other. They're equal worship as well. But as far as the responsibility is concerned of house, the maintenance, man has that responsibility in Islam. That woman doesn't have to go to work to support, but now the father's role has changed, and so has mother's role changed in today's society, in the Western world especially, when both have to work to, with such a rise in inflation. If you live in Toronto and you want to buy a house, $1 million house, on a single income is impossible for many. So both the husband and wife have to go. But the important question comes is now balance in life. And this is what I just performed a marriage before. That's why I'm a little late in logging in earlier. I was in Mississauga. There was an accident on the highway as usual. So I managed to get here quickly enough anyway. But they think that the role has changed and how they can balance the life work and home duties as well as the children responsibility. Who can? So it is a shared, I would say, shared responsibility that both have, but the father still has a greater role to play in today's society, as in today's context as well. And that is what sometime in my office, people will say, "Oh, I have to leave the meeting early." So this is when I was working. Now I'm retired. It's because today is my duty to cook. Something that traditionally was not the responsibility of shared duties before. Today, both fathers and mothers are involved, no matter what religion they are. It's just that they're trying to live the life in today's society with such a economic downturn. And COVID has pushed us to another level, I would say. So the role has changed, but there is no claim of superiority of gender over one another. As far as the worship is concerned, is the duties that they have to divide and reciprocate.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges you have faced in your faith community when it comes to men's attitudes towards their daughters? Rabbi Weiss.
As I said earlier, in our movement, in the Reform movement, this isn't as much of an issue as it is in the more traditional movements, as boys and girls and men and women are religiously equal in the Reform movement and the conservative movement for the most part, which represents 80% of affiliated Jews in North America. But so in our congregation, boys and girls both become obligated to the commandments, reach the legal age of adulthood at 13, which is simply a Jewish legality, not anything related to being Canadian, in which they turn adult at 18, but all of them read from the Torah. All of them help lead worship. They count in the quorum of 10 adult Jews that we need to pray together. In the Orthodox world, which is our most traditional movement, men and women have very, very different roles. They study different subjects in schools. They dress differently. They have different religious obligations. And in that world, boys are valued over girls in many ways. And I think that over time, that has changed a bit. It changes a little more slowly. But I'm proud to be part of a movement where the issue of equality is not as much of an issue as it used to be.
Okay. Pastor Schori?
Yes, I just have to say, I just so appreciate this conversation. This is so good for me to be connected with you all and have this talk. From my experience, I would say that one of the greatest challenges, it doesn't necessarily in my congregation necessarily show at a young age, but I think that it shows. It is shown in how parents respond to their kids that have gotten into unhealthy relationships. And it's not just my congregation. I've seen it in a lot of congregations in this area. I'm in the Chicagoland area, and I had a woman reach out to me years ago. She was a graduate of a large Bible college in Chicago, Moody Bible, and she was married to a man who also was a graduate from there, and they were house parents for underprivileged children. And one day he attacked her, and she managed to get his hands off her throat, and she shoved him off the bed, off of her, and she ran out of there and never looked back. Well, she was shunned by her parents, she was shunned by her siblings, and she was shunned by her church. And she really was going to throw out organized religion entirely. And she ended up reaching out to me. She saw something that I wrote online, and she said, I think I'm just going to try that church just once. And she came, and we had an incredible conversation, but it was heartbreaking for me to learn these things. I just can't imagine. I can't imagine looking at my faith and looking at my daughter and saying that clearly God wants me to subject my daughter to something that's this devastating to her mind, body, and spirit. And she found refuge in our church, which I'm so thankful for, and ended up being on our staff at one point as well. So the challenge that I see is largely with adult children who end up being in relationships or being married, and because of the stigma on divorce in the Christian world, I think that there's a significant misunderstanding about the heart of God towards his sons and daughters. And I think that sometimes people end up creating a theology based on some misinterpreted small passages rather than looking at the heart of God towards his children.
Yeah. Imam Patel?
Well, to discuss this question, I would first say that in Canada, we have Muslim community is not one community. Mm-hmm. We are communities. Muslims have come from many parts of the world with different cultural traditions. Mm. And as Islam spread from Arabian Peninsula to other parts of the world, many cultural practices blended into people's lives, daily lives. And depending on that society that they have treated women differently from different angles. And that is not part of Islam, I would say, in many cases, many of those practices, cultural practices, such as, for example, gender favoritism in raising children, boys preferred over girls. No. In some countries, there are a lot of abortion taking place now with the technology advancement that they can diagnose the pregnancies. They don't want girls. Yeah. Islam prohibits doing that because from the time of Prophet Muhammad becoming a prophet, he stopped the infanticide that was taking place in Arabia, pagan society. So this is something against Islam in case of any kind of gender favoritism. They have to be treated equally. In one instance, a man brought a gift to the Prophet. His companion brought a gift to the Prophet. Said, I want you to give this gift to my son. He said, how many children you have? He said he had 3 or 5. He says, have you given each of them? He says, no, you have to go back and give each one of them. Don't come back until you give one. You can't prefer one over the other. And there are traditions like that prohibits any kind of gender favoritism. And in eyes of God, as said, that worship is the same, and Islam regard woman as a full person in the society. The Prophet also said that acquiring knowledge is compulsory on both men and women. He used the word men and women, not just on men. So women can become a scholar at any level, can become a judge, a police officer, a ruler also. So all those things are allowed in Islam, but the society's cultural boundaries have prevented women from rising to the occasion until, let's say, the feminist movement brought some level of equality. But we still have a big wage gap in Canada for men and women in a number of professions. So this is with the equality that we are seeking. What kind of equality? That's what we have to define. That Islam doesn't stop women from rising to any level of education or profession or any other status in the society that they can. But they have been suppressed, I would say, even in the name of Islam, like what is happening in Afghanistan. In Saudi Arabia, women were prevented from driving, and that has nothing to do with Islam until recently. Now, so there are all these things are imposed by certain governments in the name of Islam, as Rabbi Cory Weiss said as well, that the people have interpreted differently and imposed for their own, whether power acquisition or what, that Islam does not allow that. So even in wedding, that bride's consent is taken first. If she says no, so there's no forced marriage. But still in some societies, it's Muslim society I'm talking about, that still the bride doesn't even know and the marriage is performed. Father thinks that, they have the right to do that, which is no God-given right for the father to do that kind of thing without...
So basically, just to sum up what you're saying, Imam Patel, is that it's culture, once it's mixed in with religion, it's culture that imposes these boundaries, that imposes segregation. I think there's something there, because I'm Buddhist, and every single country that has a majority Buddhist population observes it differently. And it's always mixed in with the local traditions and the cultural beliefs, and certain things that aren't even in our religious texts. They're just they just glossed over and said, oh, it's part of the religious text. It's not at all.
Patriarchal society that we have inherited over the years, centuries. And it still prevails in many parts of the world.
I mean, I can see that. I mean, I have a friend who's a very old friend, Imam Patel, who's Muslim, and he has 3 daughters, and I think 3 daughters, and they're all raised equal. They're all raised, they're all raised to be independent and to find their place, and to they're educated and all that. But at the same time, I can see I'm in Malaysia, Imam Patel, and there's a very big, very large conservative movement here, Islamic conservative movement here. So I can actually see the difference, and I get what you're saying, that it is culture, because my old friend is British Asian, so he's progressive. He, whatever he's taught in both, in both the mosque and at school, it all mixes together, and he's very progressive. But then over here, it's very conservative in many circles. So you can see the different attitudes that he had, the difference between his attitude towards his daughters and the attitudes of many Muslim men here towards their daughters.
It is true. That is what people judge orthodoxy and liberalism of any religious identity based on their practices. If something that is traditional, that is even not part of the faith, they say, no, this person is very liberal or orthodox. And people then have either have to comply with society's norms, or completely break away as a kind of a cast out person. But in Canada, we have such a society that nobody can judge one another.
Yeah.
We are communities in a big, larger community, larger area.
There's a question from the audience based on what Imam Patel has said. There's a question for everyone. So Anusha, who's our producer for today, has a question. She says, how would you approach teaching people to separate culture and tradition and religion and the interpretation of religious text when it comes to things like gender roles? Rabbi Weiss, what do you think? How do you do that?
Okay, so I was going to endorse what Imam Patel says in that I think that being in North America, all of the major religions have come to at least a little bit reflect the kind of societies we've created here. But to answer that question, partly it has to do with the culture of the religious leader, that we can set the tone and teach our congregants and our communities that there are very different interpretations of our sacred texts, especially. And I'll give you an example, if I may. In terms of the role of men and women in the world, in creation, our Torah and the Hebrew Bible, and thus the Christian Old Testament, start with two stories of creation. In chapter 1 of Genesis is the story of the 7 days of creation. And in that story, God creates humans. And in that very story, which is toward the end of chapter 1 of Genesis, it says, Zacharu nekeva asu asa otam, that God made the humans male and female. And so there we learn in our movement that men and women were created at the very same time and thus should be considered equal. However, chapter 2 says that God took the man and put him to sleep and took out a piece of him, either his rib or his side, depending how you understand the Hebrew, and made the woman out of that. And thus the woman is now subservient to the man. And like any ancient text from any of our religions, you can read that how you like. You can emphasize what you like. You can look to chapter 2 to say that women should serve men and that women are the property of men, or as I prefer to teach and emphasize, that you can look at chapter 1 and realize that God made us all at the same time, and thus we should be religiously equal. And so it really is on the teachers and the interpreters to kind of set that tone as to how we're going to teach these ancient texts.
Okay, Pastor Schori?
Yeah, it's so good. I talk about this a lot with people because in my faith tradition, it's very, very common for people to camp out on their favorite verses and construct a theology based on a very, very tiny percentage of a text that they just happen to have a natural affinity for. And usually that affinity comes from a cultural thing more than a religious thing. So people in the southern U.S. might look at things very different than people in the north. Just like in the United States, slavery very different for the South than it was for the North. Same as religion. I think we just have to be very, very cautious to recognize. Just teach people that we all have a lens in which we view life, which means it's how we read the Bible as Christians. And we're all going to have biases, and some of those are biases that we don't see. And I think that we need to approach it all with humility to say, regardless of what I think, I read and I see life, I see scripture with a particular lens, and I need to be humble enough to say that I can miss the mark on something just like everybody else. And I know that for me, I've said to my church many times before that I'm very confident that one day when I face God, he's going to say, yeah, you missed some things. You thought you were really right on this, and you were really not. So I think it's just really important for all of us to have an approach where we lead with humility and recognize like culture sneaks in there. Everybody's culture affects everybody's religion and our upbringing. As someone with a counseling background, I have a master's degree in counseling. My supervisor told me that he said, Neil, do not be deceived. You carry your family of origin around with you in your back pocket wherever you go. So I know that I look at even my faith through the eyes that my parents gave me.
Yeah, and I guess what you're saying is we all need to be aware of our cultural bias. But that's easier said than done, right? Because we're all marinating in culture and we don't really see stuff unless we, maybe we go abroad or something like that, and we're forced to see our cultural biases. Now, on to Imam Patel, because he started this part of the discussion. He kicked it off. What do you think, Imam Patel? How do you approach teaching people to separate culture and tradition from religion?
Thank you for that question, really. And I would say go back to what Rabbi Weiss said about the creation of first human being, Adam and Eve. And we, as part of Abrahamic faith, we believe that they were the first human being. That while whatever God whether created man first or woman first, doesn't mean that they are subservient to each other. God said their worship is the same. That in the eyes of God, their worship is equal. So that matters. But I would say now that first, teaching the children about gender roles begins from the house. How people treat members of the family, how they treat each other, spouses, husband, wife. If the children learn from there. Now, years ago, I came across one example in a religious class. One young boy, he hit another girl. And the teacher asked, why did you hit her? He says, well, it isn't man supposed to beat women. Mm-hmm. So he must be watching that at home. And to this day, domestic violence, or whatever they call, they're changing now to intimate partner violence or all these different terms, is still a big problem in our society, no matter what faith people have. On top of that, now that we have here in Canada is a big issue about gender roles, that they're declassifying the male and female sort of identification. In the marriage application license, it is applicant, no more bride and groom. In number of other places, it says no parent now, not a father and mother. They are taking that out, all from government documents. The court has renamed I would say the family law has renamed custody to a co-parenting now. Mm. So all these things, the definitions are changing on gender roles and gender. But we have to know that we are human beings. God has created male and female. Each has, biologically, they are different creations. Like a man cannot give birth to a child. So therefore, all those things, they need to explain that you have different roles to play in the society, in the family. It is not that one is superior to the other, basically. That's what people exercise that right. He says, no, rights are equal. And how we live, how we grow up in the family, to teach them these roles that they have over there, that gives the shared responsibility in every house for them. That you have to start with that, not that said, okay, this is for boys only, or the boys get only this one, this much gift, or so. So all those parts is a teaching, and how much time we are spending with our children. That's the big question. With both working 8-10 hours a week and getting home even late now with all this traffic, gridlocks. So it becomes really hard for many parents to spend time with children. They are outsourced, basically, to daycare. And then they said, hey, they feel guilty about it. So where we have failed? Well, they have failed in that how people can impart their teaching. Religion allows time to spend and encourages and balance the life, that how we can raise our children and explain to them from the religious point of view. That in Islam, it says women have certain roles. Okay, they are exempt from, adult women are exempt from prayers. when they are in the menstrual cycle or postnatal period. The father has a responsibility to provide for the family, all those things that we start explaining to children. But currently, now is the question of respecting and the rights of women as well as any other transgender or binary. That's a big question now that on identity classification that we are facing here in the society.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this. So let's move on to male role modeling. So many fathers take their cue from their dads and their father figures, as Rabbi Weiss and Pastor Schori and I were talking about before we went on air, and from their peers who are dads. And even in this media-saturated age, from celebrities, including high-profile male religious leaders who may not be great examples of fatherhood. These male role models might promote traditional fatherhood, where fathers are absent parents, or they might believe that fathers need to be domineering in order to maintain their status as the head of the family, or they might even be domestic or sexual abusers. Now, do you think that the social changes towards gender equality and equity over the past half century have affected the way that some well-known religious figures and leaders who were previously held up as male role models are perceived? Rabbi Weiss.
So as I said earlier, in our tradition, there are a lot of religious heroes and leaders and models who were not great models of fatherhood, right? Abraham almost sacrificed his son Isaac. Isaac divided his family by favoring one son over the other. His son Jacob, who didn't learn from his father's mistake, did the same thing with his 11th son Joseph, which caused him to be sold into slavery and the family to be divided for 20 years. Moses was an absent father, and so have many political and religious leaders have been throughout history, favoring their work or seeing their work as more important than being at home. But I do believe that fatherhood and the role of dads has evolved a lot over the 4,000 years of Jewish history, because already by the time of the Talmud, the father's role is spelled out. It says that our job, if we have a son, is to circumcise him, to teach our children Torah, to help them learn a trade, to encourage them to find a spouse. We are also, dads are commanded to teach our children to swim. And I think to swim.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, the rabbis have the same look on their face too, Regina. They wonder why swimming of all things, after all those other things that seem to be so obvious. And I think it means that we're supposed to teach our children lessons that will help them to become independent. If I can just quote a colleague, Rabbi Elise Wechterman, says that this list means that a father should teach his children a love of learning, how to create meaningful relationships, how to be productive and contribute to the world, and the practical skills that one needs every day to survive, including, as she puts it, how to stay afloat when things get tough. And I think that fathers, as well as mothers, have been recognizing those changing roles over the years.
Yeah. And Pastor Schori?
Yes, I was just thinking as Rabbi Cory was sharing, one of the greatest examples that I can give is that the Reverend Billy Graham. The Reverend Billy Graham is known as like one of the greatest evangelists in the last century. I'm not sure what's going on there. Can you guys hear me okay?
We hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, all of a sudden I heard this, a lot of noise. So the Reverend Billy Graham was interviewed near the end of his life about his greatest successes and his greatest regrets. And I think that the interviewer was really excited to hear him talk about all of his ministry. And he said, I'm glad I got to do all that. He said, but the greatest regret that I have is that I was not there for my children in the way that I should have been when they were growing up. And I have paid for that. I love that he was humble enough to acknowledge that, because I think that so many pastors over the years and generations have looked at Billy Graham as sort of this, the kind of like the Apostle Paul, just a really prolific evangelist of the Christian faith. And for Billy Graham to acknowledge that in an interview as he reflected on his life, I think was very, very important for pastors of my parents' generation and my generation, because I think there is a tendency in our culture in the U.S. to always like work more, whether it's religious leaders or people in the secular world. We idolize those who give their lives to their trade, to their work, and we lift people up that are away from the house a lot. And I think for Billy Graham to say what he said, I think was sort of a check for all people within Christendom to say, what are we teaching our families? What is the most important? And I would contend that if I'm not loving my wife and loving my daughters well, my faith really doesn't mean a whole lot. And I would bet that all of us could say that here as we share.
Yeah. Imam Patel?
Yes, I think I will echo the same words that Rabbi Weiss said, that the prophet's examples are not the best. We can say, but
they were good at other things.
Yeah, but the religious leaders seem to follow those examples, whether they say they are kept busy by the community's demands or what. And Billy Graham's example is a good one to understand, that you don't have to reach certain age to regret that you haven't spent time with your children. And in today's fast-moving, fast-paced society, many people feel that after certain years, say, I'm sorry, I haven't spent much time with my children. But what is the use of feeling sorry after they have grown up, that you miss their childhood, you miss their teen years? So this is where I always tell people about balancing work and life in marriage workshops, that this society's trend is different. Both parents are working parents, but still they need to spend the time with children. And as far as role models are concerned, who do you look at? Sports role models, they are away for games, away from the city, many times from their homes. Movie actors, they are also busy shooting the movies. Religious leaders, faith leaders, they are also out preaching different cities, as well as maybe in their own society. They have no time, day and evening, they have to devote time because there is a demand for them. And whether it is healing or whether it is marriage or funeral or what, they just have to get out of the house at odd hours and sometimes. So this is where we are not really looking at our own life and say, hey, where we put a curtain, where we draw boundaries. That says we can't say sorry, faith leaders especially. And when we say sorry, we feel guilty. That say, hey, sorry, I can't help you. Yeah. And so it is really a challenging question that says how we can which role models we can look at. They are not best examples they're the examples of absent fathers. So at home, how we can balance our life, how much time we are spending with our life. If we go back to the 60s, the hippie generation, that was a rebellion against the society, because many researchers say that parents have not spent time with their children. They have not bonded enough. And that was a rebellion against the society's trends that were prevailing at the time, over industrialization, over work, greed, whatever we may say.
So all of you talk about, at least Rabbi Weiss and Imam Patel talked about, they're not the greatest dads in scripture. So how on the flip side, related to that, how can religious leaders like yourselves, who are dads, model healthy, non-sexist and non-misogynistic parenting for the fathers in your faith communities? So Rabbi Weiss, how do you do it?
Okay, so I think Pastor Schori and you and I talked about this a little earlier before we started, that our children really do watch everything we do. They learn to be parents from us. They learn to be married from us. And so that means that fathers and mothers should be living examples of how to be good parents, how to be caring partners, how to make a difference in the world, how to love your neighbor, how to love the stranger, how to affect what we call tikkun olam, the repair of what is broken in the world. And as a father, I've spoken to my children and the children of my congregation about decency and fairness and equality, the kind of decent, fair, and just world that God desires us to work toward. We use in our synagogue non-gendered language for God. We don't call God him or he or she or her for that matter, as we believe that God has no gender. We strive to give leadership and teaching roles to everyone in the congregation, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. I've striven to teach my sons the responsibilities that come with fatherhood, and being in healthy relationships, and to show respect for whoever they're with. So we really try to talk about that a lot.
Okay, Pastor Schori.
The thing that I do personally with my kids, I really try to be present. I think it's really, really important to model presence. Our kids know, my kids certainly know, since they were really little, if I'm really present with them or if I'm just sitting in the same room. Mm-hmm. I think that it's very, very evident when we go out to lunch with someone and they're constantly looking down at their phone, and they can technically say that they had lunch with you, or maybe that's us doing that, because we've all done that before, looking at our phone a little too much. But my kids definitely have called me out over the years when I would kind of treat them like I was marking a checkbox rather than spending time with them. So over the years, I've learned how to be more present. From a faith perspective, we believe in the Christian faith that Jesus was incarnational, that he came to be with lost people. He came to be with people to show us a better way to live. And one of those ways is to actually be with people. I think it's a lost art, seeing people be listened to and cared for in a way that's intentional. And I think that whether you have boys or girls, boys and girls need those, they need the evidence of God's love rather than us just teaching about God. They need to see God modeled in the house. And I think that fathers have a huge role in being able to help be a part of setting the tone in the household. And it makes a huge, huge difference.
So as a pastor, when you do this, you're role modeling for all the other dads in your community as well. I think with Rabbi Weiss as well, with the synagogue and Imam Patel, with modeling being present as a parent.
Yes, I think that's incredibly important. And people notice that. It's just like our kids notice what we're really all about. We can say that we care about certain things, but they'll call us out on if it's true or not. One of the greatest compliments that I can get from someone in my church is that when they say something like, "Neil, I can tell how much you and your family love each other." That's a huge victory to me, because if I can miss out on a whole lot of other things, but if I miss out on loving my family well, I basically haven't lived out my faith.
Yeah, Imam Patel.
Yes, the question I always ask people: do all the fathers or any father can ask their children, have I been a good father to you? And what answer they will give. We have to think about, reflect upon that. That's so much so when they are grown up and they said they can proudly say, yes, my father has been very kind, very good to me, raised me in a way. And now they can tell their children that said, I'm doing this because we were raised this way. We have to do, faith leaders have to be the living example to the congregation.
Yeah.
So what they preach, they have to live that as well. Mm. And that is the example. People look towards the faith leaders' example, but then also the children look to their parents, as Rabbi Weiss. And Pastor Schori also said that what parents do at home, their eating habits, their sleeping habits, all this they watch. And mother is the first school for all children. But the father role is there just as much. That they are looking towards the father. Like my mother used to say, the little child, my children said they were all with her all day. And when I come home, they just turn to the father. So because they missed the father and me during the day. And I heard that from other parents as well, that yes, when the father come home, the children cling to their father because they haven't seen him all day. So this is how the relationship is developed, and they have to be the model for their children. And that is how you discipline them, how you direct and tell them what kind of voice we are using, what kind of tone, what way we are disciplining them, how time out is given, because physical punishment is not going to help on any, both illegal and also bad for the child because they live by this trauma.
Yeah.
And
So basically, I'm a teacher outside of my activism, and I live by this maxim: never ever, never ever ever tell kids do as I say, not as I do. Because you can absolutely guarantee that they will do as you do, not as you say.
yeah,
And
Right.
I think that applies to adults too, right? The dads in your community
Yes.
look at you, and you can't be beating your wife and then telling them that domestic violence is bad. It
yeah.
just doesn't work, right?
Yes.
No, that's the
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, so let's talk about toxic masculinity and what we can do to stop it propagating amongst our boys. So patriarchal societies are not just deadly for women and girls. They are also damaging for men and boys because they enforce destructive norms such as socializing boys into anger and violence as a response to problems and challenges, while suppressing other emotions such as sadness and anxiety. And we know that this takes a heavy mental and emotional toll on boys and men over time. So, how can faith leaders like yourself help dads in your communities to actually prevent and/or counteract this harmful patriarchal programming in their sons and the boys in your community in general? So, let's start again with Rabbi Weiss.
So we encourage our members to report domestic violence. We take our reporting responsibilities very seriously as a congregation and as having a school as well. We try to teach that the patriarchy that marked Judaism, at least for the first half of our history, is just that. It's history. It's the context of, 4,000 years ago and 3,000 years ago, and does not have to be the context of today. I believe that God and the rabbis who have taught us want us to continue to evolve in our understanding of gender and equality. I really do believe that. We have many religious texts that speak to us about controlling our anger and our passions, and we teach them, and not causing fear in our spouses and children, which is considered a sin against God. So we remind them that our tradition, even though it's patriarchal, still began to evolve from its very start, from a patriarchy that where women were considered property of their fathers until they were married, when they became property of their husbands, to a world that is very, very different and much more evolved than that one.
Pastor Schori?
I think it's really, really important to for Christians to look at the Old Testament and the New Testament and recognize that just because it says something doesn't mean it's a prescription. So there are prescriptions and descriptions, and I think oftentimes we turn things that are just descriptions of what's happening into something that is a good thing or a positive thing that God must want for you. So I think that that's a start. I think contextually, I think we have to be very, very cautious in how we direct people, that we help them see the difference, understand how to interpret text, and authors understand the author's intent, not just look at things and say, well, if it says it, then we're supposed to do it. That's quite unthinking. We wouldn't do that with any other text. We wouldn't do that with the newspaper. We wouldn't do it with anything that we learn in school. Far more importantly, in my view, than that is that we have a chance to show people as men that emotions aren't just exclusively for women. Men have emotions too. So I think it's really, really important to show young boys that emotions are not a negative thing, that it's not weak to cry. Whether you're hurt and you cry physically, you're emotionally hurt, you're just sad about something. You experience sadness. You lose a grandparent. It's okay to cry. I've modeled that. I'm a naturally pretty emotional person. I'm pretty emotionally connected, and I've cried many, many times in front of my daughters, and they don't think anything of it because they just say, yeah, men have emotions just like we do. And my daughters all have spectrums of emotion. They're not all the same. Just because they're female doesn't mean that they have a certain level of emotion. All three of my daughters express their emotions differently. And I just let them know, however you feel is okay. And it's the same with boys. It's the same with men. We all feel things differently, and however that's expressed, whether it's joy or grief, it's okay. So just normalizing the feelings and experience that we have takes a lot of the pressure off of boys to be tough. And it takes the pressure off of girls to feel like they must have all these emotions because that's what they're told. We're all humans, and we experience things in differing degrees and ways.
And I think that's especially pertinent now that in a lot of societies worldwide, we are recognizing people with autism. We are recognizing people who are along the spectrum, and everyone along the spectrum express their emotions differently from neurotypical people, and that's where the whole it's kind of sticks us, it kind of throws a spanner in the works, right? With the whole thing about men should not have, women are emotional and men are, and one thing I like to sort of retort when I'm facing male chauvinists and sexist and misogynists is that they keep going on about, oh, women are too emotional, and I just deadpan tell them anger is an emotion too.
Mhm.
And if all you're doing is expressing anger and using your violence to do it, that's still an emotion too. So, what happened to all your other emotions? I asked them. They get really mad. They get really
Right.
angry about it. Yeah. Anyway, so Imam Patel, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, thought is that in Canada, the imams and the scholars, they have a challenge to teach people who have come from different traditions, cultural traditions, and say that this is any kind of domestic violence, whether it is with children or a wife or anyone for that matter, is not condoned in Islam. Example is that he said that don't treat your wives with kindness, don't beat them, don't abuse them. I'm the best of husband to my wives. So using the prophetic tradition about teaching the children and teaching and explaining and avoiding any kind of violent acts for that matter. But what is happening is it doesn't have to be physical violence in the family. Emotional, like getting angry and abuse, verbal abuse. Play. I don't know what's this noise coming in the background.
Oh, I think it's Rabbi Weiss's papers.
Oh, yes. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So people verbal abuse and anger that also leaves a trauma on the children.
Mhm.
And recently, I've heard of one 6-year-old who lived with watching the mother getting beaten up by the father. Even after in teen years, that she was still going through that trauma, needed psychiatric help, counseling. So children grow up with that kind of traumatic experience. Especially now we have all these refugee children coming from war-torn areas, watching violence and so on. It becomes even more challenging for us, for the imams or rabbi or pastors or anyone, to counsel them how to heal those wounds. But in a normal family, that when there shouldn't be any kind of conflict or violence, but we are experiencing that. And that is the only way we can explain. Say, look, religion doesn't teach it. Islam doesn't teach this. These are the way the Prophet lived, the companions lived. These are examples in front of us. And you don't have any kind of God-given rights to claim that kind of superiority to abuse any one of them. And it is not restricted to people going through trauma in workplaces. Employers abuse their workers at times. People sometimes feel helpless to complain. But these are things that then the emotions the father may have cannot, if he will take it out on his family members from workplace. It's not bringing work home, but bringing that kind of treatment and the anger that developed at workplace now being extracted among family members. So this is, we have to watch out for all these signals, that how we can avoid this kind of thing. And if we are going through any kind of crisis, the problem is the stigma. There's a stigma to seek help. Oh, I don't need counseling. That's the first question. I don't need therapy.
Yeah,
and this is hard to convince people. In fact, for many newcomers here, the counseling and therapy is not known to them. Because traditionally they would fall back on extended family in their home countries or other places. And it is also a stigma even to go and seek help there. But here also importantly that they have to get where they can get help, especially when they are alone themselves. There is no extended family. And it becomes more challenging for any faith leader how to counsel such trauma, how to sort of squeeze out those emotions, positive or negative.
Yeah, and it's, I think it's especially prevalent in conservative cultures.
Yes.
Where people don't want to talk about it. I mean, Rabbi Weiss and Pastor Schori and I were talking about this before we went on air, and basically it's like, they just don't want to talk about it. And counseling is seen as taboo. Therapy is seen as taboo. So you all have your work cut out for you. And speaking of that, do you have any particular suggestions for fathers who are currently in the middle of raising sons and are realizing that there are particular subsection of the faith community that they are part of? And we talked a bit about this earlier, where you say that there are different, everything from different communities even within your own faith, are part the sub community that they are part of teaches toxic masculinity, sexism, misogyny, while turning a blind eye to domestic abuse and rape. Rabbi Weiss, what are your thoughts on this?
So there are certainly stories of domestic violence and of rape and sexual assault in our sacred texts. They're in there. As well as misogynistic and homophobic and xenophobic and racist teachings. As a liberal Jew, I constantly remind my community that the values of the Hebrew Bible often reflect, as I mentioned earlier, the ethical sensibilities of our ancestors 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And those ethics evolve over time. We understand in our day that toxic masculinity, patriarchy, sexism, and violence should be relegated to the annals of ancient history, and that God wants us to do better than our ancestors did, in the same way that we want our children to do better than we do, and that we hope we did better than our parents in many ways. So we've made a lot of progress over these millennia, but there is still a lot more work to do to create an equitable society. And our Torah teaches that when God spoke to Abraham and Sarah and invented Judaism by making a covenant with them, God said, "Hey, bracha, be a blessing, bring blessing to the world." And even though everyone's understanding of how to do that has changed over time, that is still what guides us.
Okay, Pastor Schori?
That's good. These are such important issues, and I think that I've actually connected with a lot of people who have found themselves to be in faith communities just like what you described, unfortunately. And so I won't pull any punches here. I would leave that community. If you find yourself in a community of faith and you're finding that there is a toxic masculinity that is being taught, it's most likely being caught from above. And a lot of times, if you pull the curtain back, you'll see some very unhealthy leadership, and it's probably being propagated there. Occasionally, you'll find out that there are people who are teaching things that they don't understand, and they're open to conversation. You can find out pretty quickly if people are open to change But I often believe that these are deeply entrenched and deeply held beliefs that are held by leaders, and they're passed on throughout the congregation. And when it comes to abuse issues and ignoring domestic violence and rape, I see no place for a father to keep his family in that setting. I would say don't waste time. Get out of that community and find one that is not toxic, because those things will all be those will characterize your families from generation to generation, unless you break that pattern of teaching, because your kids will catch on to what's being taught over and over and over again.
Yeah, and the biggest example of this is President Jimmy Carter, right? He left his church after decades of his church because, and it was a huge statement, because he said he could no longer, not to say he could no longer, but he just broke with them and they just refused to change. And that we need more of that, I think, in a way. So Imam Patel, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, see, toxic masculinity depends on many faith leaders, how they interpret Quranic verses or the prophetic traditions. And sometimes imams, they said, no, man has a right to beat the wife, sometimes people will say, which is nothing in the Quran, nothing in the prophet's tradition about it. So how we can really remove this is a big challenge. Cannot run away. This is one of the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, is that if you see anything wrong happening, try to correct it by hand. If not, at least by persuasion. If not, feel sorry that I wish I had the power to stop this. And legal course is always available for any kind of abuse or so on. But people feel they don't come out and report because they feel embarrassed. And even because they say, hey, I don't want to become a talk of the town about abuse taking place in my home. So they avoid even talking about it until it reaches such a point of no tolerance, I would say, that then they will call the police also. But the other problem is that how justice system treats such cases. That is something that men have argued that, okay, a lot of times the lead it favors women, but it also kind of not really deal properly with the requirements or the family issues that they're going through. So it's often like divorce cases, for example. I remember I was on a task force years ago by Ontario government. They said they wanted to make mediation mandatory before going for divorce proceedings in the court, because then it causes a lot of expenses and a lot of problem for children. So they produced a kind of a little movie or documentary. They're showing a cow that husband is pulling the head, the wife pulling the tail. The children stand there watching, and the lawyer is milking the cow, with all due respect to lawyer profession. so that at least before they file their case goes to the court, so understand what you will be going through. So this is also leaving, and I find that the breakdown in marriage has created such a problem for children, that for children coming from broken homes, whether there was domestic abuse or whether there were other cases of violence at home, they live with that trauma, and they also learn that, copy that as well. Though this was done by my father, this is what happened in my home. So all these things that we really have to ensure quality life in our families, and to do that, it becomes a challenging job for any faith leaders to explain to them from the religious perspective. From the Islamic perspective, we can explain, but it's up to them to follow. We can only take horse to the water, but we can't make them drink it just that way. So I said we can preach as much as we want, but how much they are willing to accept the teaching of the scripture that said this is not allowed according to the law of the land, according to the faith as well. So it is going to remain a challenge for a while until a generation that really catches on equality that is needed in the society. And we are coming to such an extent, we have come a long way to even define equality in many ways.
Okay. So understanding the importance of consent, especially sexual consent, is one of the most important conversations a father can have with his son, and a vital part of efforts to stop the rape and sexual assault of women and girls. This takes on even more urgency in conservative cultures, where people wield their version of religious teachings to uphold rape culture. So from your perspective as a religious leader in your community, does religion have a place when it comes to educating boys about consent? And if so, how can religion contribute to such efforts? So, Rabbi Weiss.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, our sacred texts have stories of abuse and sexual assault and rape, but even in those ancient texts, rape and sexual assault are taken very seriously. Violators are punished, though not always in ways that make sense to us in today's world. In the Talmud, the rabbis teach that a man must never force his wife into sexual relations. Sex and marriage must be consensual. And I believe that we have to teach our children not only about the mechanics of sex and reproduction, which is part of a parent's job, but also about the ethics of sex and creating sacred relationships. And sacred relationships are always built on equality and on mutual consent.
Okay, Pastor Schori?
Yes, I believe that the primary example for me as a Christian and for people who believe in Christ is looking at his example where he put everyone else before himself. I think that if we followed that as Christians, we'd have some really, really great relationships, very healthy. To love someone is not to take something from them, but to be with them and to have a mutually enjoyable experience. And that is that's what a healthy sexual relationship should be like. And that's what a healthy, any form of relationship should be like. So whether it's sexual or whether it's friendship, it should be more give and less take. And I think that what's the role that we have to teach boys? I don't think it's a whole lot different than teaching girls, because I think both need to know that they both have rights and they both have responsibilities. That's just the nature of being human.
Yeah, I have friends who are women who are Christian feminists or feminist Christians. You know, I can't figure out which description comes first, but they're welded so closely together. And when we talk about stuff like this, they like to tell me about, they've mentioned about how in the Bible, some man was complaining that some women were wearing clothes that stirred his lust, and Jesus told him to just pluck out his eyes.
That's right.
Basically, it's on you. It's not on the women.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I love that too, and it's true. It's so easy. I think it's so easy to look at someone else and say, "You're the reason that I struggle with X, Y, or Z." It takes a whole lot more courage to say, "I have something that's broken in me that wants to objectify you." So teaching ownership of our feelings and our desires. Not only not acting on them, but dealing with that core of what's caused them. Being honest about it in appropriate contexts and having accountability is essential.
Yeah. So Imam Patel, any thoughts?
Well, you mentioned about close the eyes. Jesus said that some women who don't want to wear hijab or body covering, they'll say, "Hey, why would men get excited? That's their problem, not ours. we need to dress the way we want." I remember in the 60s, so when the teenage pregnancy was very much on the rise, and then researchers, sociologists, and others say, well, the word sex is talking about it was a taboo in many. And children are not talked about it. They don't understand. And they would and the questions many were asked in schools and universities, where they learned about sexism from the magazines, not at home. So that opened the eyes of parents to say we need to discuss this subject, even though it is something people don't want to. But to explain to the children the role of the gender as well as the talking about sex when they're grown up. Now, when it's, according to Islam, talking about teaching them about the sexuality and so on is a private matter, not a public matter. They need to be taught at home, not in the classroom. That is done in some cases today. So these are things that is going to be a challenge for many parents, that they are learning something else from what they are teaching at home. So it is not a question of liberalism or conservatism. It is something natural for people to understand and learn that when girls become certain age, when they attain puberty, boys also, how they, and the consent is always a necessity that people have. You cannot do anything without consent, any act for that matter. You need permission. People nowadays says, okay, this meeting is going to be photographed or videotaped. Anybody, they look for that kind of consent, but consent in all parts of life is something that is a necessity. We have to take consent before we do anything that the other person has to offer. So that's what I can add to this discussion.
Yeah. So one final question here, because we do have to wrap up soon and it's getting late for all of you. Do you have any particular tips or suggestions for dads in faith communities who want to raise feminist sons and who have become self-aware enough to know that they may have inadvertently taught their sons some sexist beliefs and they now wish to undo this? Rabbi Weiss.
I would say, number one, go look for the texts that teach equality of the genders, that teach respect for sacred relationships, but also go and study the troubling texts and try to figure out where they came from and what context they come out of, and find a faith community where you can struggle with those teachings as well. And I would also remind any parent who wants to teach their children the right thing to go to Leviticus 19. Al ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, which means that when we are bystanders, we are complicit. When we are silent, we are complicit. And that we need to teach our children not only to behave in sacred ways, but to also make sure to call out others when they don't, so that we can create the decent kind of society that we all are aiming for.
And society would be so much better if people actually blew the whistle on domestic abusers.
Absolutely.
Instead of remaining silent and not doing anything, even though they are next door neighbor and you can hear everything. And not even your next door neighbor. I think in many cases, the entire neighborhood can hear the screaming and the beatings, and nobody says anything. They actually did an experiment in South Africa, and they filmed it for an ad about domestic violence. Basically, they got someone to play the drums at 11:30 at night. And people felt free to go out to the house where the drum playing was taking place to tell them to pipe down. But then they played a recording of a domestic violence beating just as loudly, and no one turned up. No one turned up.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say that part of it is probably fear that you get some of that violence on yourself as well. But, go, there's so many, all the anti-violence against women organizations have websites now that tell you how to intervene safely. So I'm going to say this as a PSA to everyone out there, leading on, following on from what Rabbi Weiss said, that, go and find out how you can intervene safely as a bystander. Become an upstander. Don't just huddle at home and do nothing. And it takes courage to do that. But, like in India, there's a campaign called Bell Bajao that happened about 10 years ago. And they taught people in the PSAs how to break that violence. It's basically, Bell Bajao means ring the bell in Hindi, I think. And press the doorbell and ask to borrow a cup of milk. Ask to borrow Ask them if they got your mail. So just that interruption can actually stop the violence. So anyway, onwards to Pastor Schori. What are your thoughts on all of this?
Oh man, so many thoughts. I would say start by owning anything that you know that you is for you to own. You know, if you're a dad and you're recognizing that you have taught your kids things that you're no longer proud of, I think sitting down and having that conversation with your kids is a really great start. I think our kids have a deep respect when we own what's ours to own, and then look for other people that are starting to have this awakening. There are people out there. Post something. It's not salacious to post on social media and say, these are some of the things that I'm thinking about. I would love to connect with other men in the area who are starting to wrestle with these questions. I would also talk about the importance of believing victims. I think that telling, being people that start with belief is incredibly important, because it's so cathartic to the experience of the victim to be believed, because there's a darn good chance that for many, many years she hasn't been believed by anyone. That's the nature of abuse. That's the nature of isolation. She's probably been told in all sorts of different ways that she's not good enough, that she's not smart enough, that she's not small enough, she's not pretty enough, she could never make it anywhere else, and she's really lucky to have him. So when we say things like, I believe victims, it doesn't mean that there's no possibility on earth that someone could possibly lie, but it's acknowledging that a person is way more likely to lie and say that they weren't abused, and when they actually were abused, than to say that they were abused when they weren't. About 2% of the people who claim to be abused that weren't, it's literally just 2% that lie. 2 to 8%, from my experience, it's probably closer to 2. So I would just say starting with belief can really start to change the culture. It's not our job to ask all the questions. It's not our job to interrogate victims. The worst thing we can do is to say, well, they were really nice to me. Well, of course they were, because they've groomed communities to believe the worst. Starting with having conversations with like-minded people. And if you find yourself in a faith community, whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or any other faith, if you find yourself in a place where no one's interested in growing and creating systems that are based on equality, go find another place, because there are other places to practice your faith where you can have families that are a whole lot healthier and more whole than if you don't.
Yeah. Imam Patel?
Well, first thing I would tell people, because we are communities, and as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of culture has blended with religious practices, is to learn to differentiate between culture and religious texts. And follow the example of the prophet as a family man, how he lived. We have a lot of texts for that about even treating his daughter, that most part of his life he spent with his younger daughter. And when she used to come, he would stand up to greet him, no matter what gathering he's in. He will stand to greet her, kiss her on the forehead, and bring her by his side, and let sit her right there. So that's how far he honored his own daughter. So we need to learn from these examples and be a role model for others, our children, that how we treat our spouses, whether husband and wife also, because there is domestic violence not just on men but women as well. As well. Once I had one person years ago come to me and said, you always preach, all the imams preach about wife abuse. Nobody talks about husband abuse. And husband abuse may not necessarily be physical, but emotional. Verbal abuse or other ways, harassment and so on. So all these things that is not part of religious texts that people follow. These are not even cultural in some cases. But it is something that people think that they have the right to do it. And this is what is wrong with people. So education, but how many people can come to the place of worship to listen to you? The message to the society in general is not easy to go out. And social media nowadays plays a big role in not solving problems, but creating more problems at times. So we are really, faith leaders are challenged by this kind of the new trends in the society, how we can best educate the people, how we can connect with them. Same thing like one of the areas that I have been advocating is community chaplaincy. That many people are disconnected from places of worship, no matter what faith they are, even Muslims and all others. So, or they can come once in a year or once in a week. So, but people need those chaplains can go out in the community where there is a need. The people will feel more comfortable to learn maybe on one, or sometimes they just need a blessing. Or so this is something that so we have not really embarked on so much on some areas in the U.S. I think community chaplaincy is working well, even for restorative justice. And here in Canada, we really need to start doing on this, that the funding by the government of like they fund the hospital and prison chaplaincy, but they also need to fund this community chaplaincy that can also solve like a number of other community disputes as well.
Yeah.
And that's something for the future to think about.
Yeah, and also having community chaplaincy means that religious leaders faith leaders can also see what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
In the communities, and be able to put a stop to things like domestic violence before it spirals out of control. And also figure out, who's watching, who are the kids watching this? Because I guarantee you, it's not just the sons in the family, but their neighbors' sons and everyone else around them. Who, I mean, if they see that, oh, it's acceptable to just not say anything, then we're not going to say anything, and it becomes normalized. And we get the problem starts when it becomes normalized, because right now in many communities it is still normalized. And there was the UN just published a study, the results of a study. 10 years on, 9 out of 10 people are still biased against women. And they did this survey across different, many countries across the world, not just in one country, but they did it worldwide. And also another shocking thing that happened was that finding that came out was that the 1 in 3 women statistic, it still stands even after 2 decades, 3 decades. It's still the same. 1 in 3 women and girls experience violence in their lives. Yeah. So I think community chaplaincy that Imam Patel is talking about would be a very good place to start for faith communities. And as Imam Patel points out, funding is needed.
Yes.
Needed for everything. Funding is seems to be a shortage of funding. There seems to be a shortage of funding for stuff like this, but never a shortage of funding for the military in most countries.
There's no approval needed for that.
So Regina, if there is funding out there, if there's someone out there who has the desire to fund these things, I promise you, we would help put that funding to good use in our communities.
Yeah. So anyone who out there who's listening to this, and this is a record, we're recording this on YouTube as well. If anyone after this, if you're watching this recording, please, if you have the funds, or if you know someone who has the funds, and it doesn't matter if wherever you are in the world, look at community chaplaincy, because a lot of people live their lives, have religion as part of their lives. And that's why we're having this panel session today, because we're acknowledging that. I know a lot of people tend to point at religion as the bad guy. And in many cases, individual cases, it is. But I think as a whole, we need to start, as we were discussing before we went on air, we need to start looking at how we can work within the system, how we can change the system. And change doesn't come fast. But I think community chaplaincy is going to speed things up, because that means
it's not
faith
just
leaders are not.
community chaplaincy can also be helpful, because with here in Ontario, especially putting emphasis now on home care rather than long-term care facilities.
Mm.
So in that case, there for last rites to be performed, those chaplains can come in at home and do that for some of the requirements that have. So there are many services they can provide at home that is right now not available, and people even have to they don't feel comfortable going to the place of worship or not have time. Here they can have at least some kind of spiritual upliftment.
And also, it's part of, the Pixel Project's motto is it's time to stop violence against women together. And I think community chaplains can also work alongside social workers, counselors, therapists, teachers, because teachers often in schools often have to take this on. Just work together with this, on this. I think we can stop it community by community. And when people say you can't stop violence against women, I often point to my own culture, Imam Patel. In the early 20th century, I think in the 1910s and 1920s, when China was in upheaval, that was when bound feet was totally abolished, because the educated middle classes and intellectuals decided that as part of progress, we cannot hobble our women and girls anymore. And so with one fell swoop, they stopped the practice. It took a while to trickle down to, the diaspora, but it did. And so I think the last person to have bound feet, I think she died in the 1990s, and that was it. No more. The practice was stopped for well over a century now. So I think that with the help of community chaplains, the help of progressive faith communities, it actually can be done. It can be done. And if I remember correctly from my studies, China history studies, I think one of the factors in stopping bound feet was Christian chaplaincy in Shanghai and all these cities. There were a lot of evangelicals and all, and I think they played a role as well. I can't remember offhand, but I do remember the historical text the textbooks talking about all the different factors that came in to stop this. And it's not just one thing, it's everyone. So we can stop this. Anyway, we are going to wrap up now. But before we go, I want to share some resources with everyone. And just to let you all know, just do stay back after we've gone off air so that we can do the other wrap up after we've gone off air. So everyone, before we wrap up, here are a few resources that you can use. So to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. We have a lot of primers for all the different types of violence against women, and you will be shocked to see how many types of violence against women there are. And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, a lot of them are cultural, Imam Patel, not religious, cultural. They're all cultural, like female genital mutilation, that's cultural, definitely. Forced marriage, child marriage, definitely cultural as well, even though they use religion to justify it. It's all cultural. And to find out more about the Fathers for Pixels program, which includes events like the one that we're in now, please go to bit.ly/dads for pixels. So capital letter DADS for the number 4, capital letter PIXELS. And additionally, the Pixel Project's Shirley Jackson Award nominated and Aldi Award nominated charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due, where The Twilight Zone Meets Promising Young Women, is now available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook editions. And I'm going to share this now to let you all know where to go get it. And the reason why we're doing this, I'm going to explain soon. Okay, can everyone see this? So the book contains 16 stories by some of today's finest horror and dark fantasy authors, including Stephen Graham Jones, Kelly Armstrong, who's Canadian, Rabbi Weiss and Imam Patel, she's Canadian, Hilary Monahan and Linda D. Addison, as well as a list of resources for victims and survivors in 205 countries worldwide. We tucked that into the back of the book. We made the book a Trojan horse of sorts. Because you know what? Abusers are not going to look at a storybook and think, there's going to be life-saving information in this. But we've actually hidden it at the back. And we've been telling people to get the book and buy the book for friends who they think need help, and tell them, look at the back. There's all the resources there. And for those of you who are interested in getting your very own copy of the anthology, you can see this on screen. It's available now from Amazon, Kobo, Google Play. Book Depository is no longer around, but you can get it from Barnes & Nobles as well, and all of the other major booksellers worldwide. And for more information about the anthology, go to bit.ly/giving the devil his due. This is case sensitive. And I'm going to stop sharing this. You can get it in any format you would like to read: ebook, paperback, audiobook. And all the net proceeds go towards keeping our campaigns, programs, and initiatives such as this one alive and kicking. Now, Rabbi Weiss, Pastor Schori, and Imam Patel, do you have any announcements you'd like to make? Anything that's coming up that's related to what we're talking about today?
I don't, but it's an honor to have been asked and to have participated. And I hope that our discussion tonight has done something positive.
Yeah. Pastor Schori, did you have any domestic violence events or anything coming up in your church?
I don't necessarily have an event, but I would love to share a website. It's documenttheabuse.com. It came out of the disappearance of Stacy Peterson in the Chicagoland area. She went to my church, and she's the one who told me that her husband, who was a police officer, had killed his previous wife. Then Stacy went missing. So the whole point of Document the Abuse is to have a resource for victims to share their story in written form, and then a video verbatim of that document. And then we save that on a Fortune 500 level server, so that if something happens to the victim, we can get that to the proper authorities. The whole point is to eliminate the issue of hearsay in abuse cases.
Okay. Imam Patel, any announcements? Any community?
Not any particular date, but I've been thinking of, we were planning on this subject. The problem is how to get audience, especially men, on this topic. Years ago, like I'm a member of the Toronto Police's Muslim Consultative Committee as well. I've been serving in an advisory capacity for 35 years with Toronto Police. I'm also chaplain with Rabbi at York Regional Police as well. And we had a forum on domestic violence and said, well, people won't come hearing this, men especially. So it said, let's call it domestic harmony. And still, it didn't attract many audience. And then now the police and others have changed the domestic violence to intimate partner violence, kind of a disguise for domestic violence. We have to blend it in, because I was a panelist in a mental health forum recently. And there's a lot of trauma due to this violence at home. Children growing up with that trauma, as well as both husband and wife, it's not easy for both of them. Life makes it harder for them to cope with challenges. So we may have to plug in this subject of family violence with other topics that can bring people in the audience. So this is something that we have been thinking, and we may plan one in the fall in the coming. I don't have any date is fixed. I will let you know if any other events. But I would say this conversation for today's topic, as well as more on similar subjects, we should continue.
Yeah, and if it's any consolation, Imam Patel, we have difficulty getting men in as well.
Yes.
It's very difficult. There's so many men who are great dads, but when you ask them to step up to speak out or to publicly talk about things, they just go, no, I'm not going to talk about it. So I think it's like you said,
Well,
Imam Patel, you need to.
we need to continue. And I think one thing I know I read and learned from is that this pandemic made many fathers realize, many parents in general, that they have not spent time with their children because they had to work from home or no work at all when they're spending time with family. So that is something that some people have open, especially sports people. Some sports personalities in cricket, soccer, and other fields, so they're taking early retirement because they realize that they have been traveling in other countries playing sports, so they haven't spent time. When they were home during pandemic, they said that this was something more beneficial to their children. The same thing for working class parents, that they were home, and that's why now people asking for hybrid work duties, that they want to spend at least 2-3 days at home if they can.
Anyway, so everyone, thank you for being with us today, and good night or good morning wherever you are in the world.
Good night. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yes.
you.
And thank you for moderating.